In 1963, an ambulance with two paramedics vanished while responding to an emergency call in rural Pennsylvania. For 18 years, their families searched desperately for answers, clinging to the hope that they were still alive. Then, in 1981, a fisherman's sonar detected something massive at the bottom of Lake Marion, something that should never have been there. What they pulled from the water that day would reveal a conspiracy that had been buried for nearly 2 decades and prove that the emergency call that night was never what it seemed. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we begin this powerful story of courage, mystery, and forgotten truth, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. Now, let's begin our story. The fog was thick on Route 47, the night of November 12, 1963. Inside Clearfield County Emergency Services, dispatcher Helen Crane answered the phone at 11:47 p.m. "There's been an accident, Route 47, mile marker 23. My wife's hurt bad." The man's voice was frantic. "Please hurry." "What's your name, sir?" "Thomas Brennan." Helen radioed Unit 7. Paramedics Jack Walsh, 34, and David Chen, 28, confirmed they were en route. 12 minutes passed, then 20. Helen tried raising them on the radio. Nothing but static. Sheriff Paul Hendricks drove to mile marker 23 with Deputy Frank Morris. They found fresh tire tracks leading down a steep embankment to Lake Marion. Halfway down, a shattered chrome mirror from the ambulance. The lake was over 100 feet deep. Divers searched for 3 days. Nothing. Margaret Walsh refused to believe her husband was dead. Every Sunday for 18 years, she left flowers at a roadside memorial. The case remained unsolved. The phone number Thomas Brennan called from didn't exist. On June 14, 1981, fisherman Carl Voss's sonar detected something massive at the lake bottom. Sheriff Tom Briggs, who'd been a deputy in 1963, assembled a dive team. At 107 feet, they found it. The ambulance sat upright on the lake bed, preserved in the cold water. 2 skeletal figures were still strapped in the front seats. The doors were locked from the outside. When they opened it, they found a waterproof medical bag on the driver's seat. Inside was a notebook. Jack Walsh's handwriting filled the first page. November 12, 1963, 11:52 p.m. "We didn't drive off the road by accident. We were forced here. When we arrived at mile marker 23, 2 men with guns were waiting. They forced us to drive to the lake. They said, 'You saw too much at the Brennan house last month.' This is what happens to people who ask questions. They locked us inside and pushed us into the water. We're trapped. The water is rising. This wasn't an accident. We were murdered. Find Thomas Brennan." Margaret read the words, tears streaming down her face. They were murdered. Sheriff Briggs reopened the case. Thomas Brennan had been a manager at Clearfield Industrial. In October 1963, Jack and David had responded to a domestic disturbance at his house. Jack had filed a report noting that Brennan's wife's injuries suggested abuse, not a fall. 4 days later, the ambulance vanished. Then Briggs found a letter in the old case files. Written by Deputy Frank Morris before he died in 1978, it was a confession. Morris admitted that Brennan and County Coroner Carl Ruskin had paid him $5,000 to bury evidence. They'd planned everything: the fake emergency call, the ambush, the murder. "I'm dying," Morris had written. "I need to make this right." Jack Walsh and David Chen were killed. Brennan and Ruskin did it. "I'm sorry." Briggs discovered that Ruskin had resigned in 1965 and died in 1979. But there was more. Ruskin's records showed dozens of suspicious deaths ruled accidental, all involving domestic violence. This wasn't just about silencing 2 paramedics. It was about protecting a network. The FBI tracked Brennan to Eugene, Oregon. When marshals arrested him in August 1981, he was 62, living under his real name. Under interrogation, he broke. "Carl Ruskin came to me," Brennan said. "He said he could make the problem go away." When the ambulance arrived that night, his men were waiting. I wasn't there, but Carl told me they forced it into the lake. Who were the men? I don't know. Carl hired them from Pittsburgh. He said they specialized in making problems disappear. The interrogator leaned forward. "How many other problems did they make disappear, Mr. Brennan?" Brennan's eyes widened. He hadn't considered that. I don't know, but Briggs did. He'd found 8 other missing persons cases between 1960 and 1965, all connected to Ruskin's falsified death reports. All witnesses to abuse or corruption. All vanished without a trace. The conspiracy was bigger than anyone imagined. Ruskin hadn't just covered up one murder. He'd been running an elimination service for abusers and corrupt officials throughout the county. Thomas Brennan was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began in early 1982. The prosecution presented Jack's notebook, Morris's confession, and FBI testimony about Brennan's embezzled payments to Ruskin. The jury deliberated 6 hours, guilty on all counts. But during sentencing, Brennan made a final statement. "Carl Ruskin told me there were others, men with money and power who needed protection. He kept a list, names, dates. He said it was insurance. If he ever got caught, he'd bring everyone down with him." "Where's this list?" the judge demanded. "I don't know. Carl died in 1979, but he said it was hidden somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever look." The courtroom erupted. If Ruskin's list existed, it could expose decades of corruption and murder throughout Pennsylvania. Investigators searched Ruskin's former properties in Arizona. Nothing. They examined his bank records, interviewed his family, combed through storage units. The list was never found. Margaret Walsh attended every day of the trial. When it ended, she stood at the Lake Memorial and read a letter she'd written 18 years earlier, but never sent. "To my Jack. When they found your notebook, I finally understood. You were a hero until the very end. You fought to tell the truth, even as the water rose. I love you. I'll always love you." The case made national headlines. Ambulance murders solved after 18 years. Pennsylvania enacted the Walsh-Chen protocols, requiring dispatchers to verify all emergency calls. But one mystery remained: Ruskin's list. In 2003, 40 years after the murders, a construction crew demolished Ruskin's childhood home in Clearfield County. Inside a wall cavity, they found a fireproof box. Inside was a leather journal. The first page read, "Insurance. If you're reading this, I'm dead." Good. I was a monster. The journal contained 47 names: politicians, businessmen, judges, law enforcement. Each entry detailed a murder Ruskin had facilitated or covered up between 1955 and 1979. Most of the named individuals were dead, but 6 were still alive. The FBI opened investigations in 3 states. 4 more men were convicted of murders committed decades earlier. 2 committed suicide before trial. The final entry in Ruskin's journal was dated November 11, 1963, the night before Jack and David died. Brennan called, panicking about the paramedic report. I told him I'd handle it. This will be the last one. I'm getting old. Too many ghosts. But I'll do this one more job, and then I'm done. He wasn't done. Ruskin had facilitated 12 more murders after Jack and David. The ambulance case was just one link in a chain of atrocities that spanned 24 years. Jack Walsh and David Chen went to work on a foggy November night, expecting a routine call. They never imagined they'd uncover a conspiracy that would take 40 years to fully expose. But when Carl Voss's sonar detected that ambulance in 1981, it didn't just solve 2 murders, it opened a door to dozens more. Margaret Walsh died in 2004, buried beside Jack. She never learned about Ruskin's journal. But her daughter Sarah was there when the FBI made the discovery. She read the entry about her father and wept. "He didn't die for nothing," she told reporters. "He exposed something that needed to be exposed, even if it took 40 years." The ambulance still sits in a Pennsylvania law enforcement museum. Next to it, under glass, is Jack Walsh's notebook and Carl Ruskin's journal. 2 documents that brought justice to dozens of families who'd waited decades for answers. Sometimes the truth takes time, but it always surfaces. Always. The end.